On the eve of a polarizing and contentious election, you probably have some enemies. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus called us to love our enemies. But to do so, we have to acknowledge that we have an enemy. Only then can we grapple with their actions, invite them to lay down their animosity, and open a path for healing, reconciliation, and unity. Join Sycamore Creek for this 5-week series to learn from Jesus how to have an enemy.
My family enjoys camping. Well, I guess it's more accurate to say that my husband and I enjoy camping and that my kids tolerate it. To be fair, we only really picked up camping as a family when we moved to Michigan a little over 2 years ago. There are a lot of reasons that we didn't camp before that, but we've really enjoyed exploring Michigan's state parks. Last summer on our big trip over the summer, we went to Leelanau and Brimley State Parks. We got to see the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum and the Sioux Locks. This year's big trip took us to Petoskey, to Straits, and to Heft State Parks. One of the surprise highlights was going to the 40-Mile Point Lighthouse. But we've also taken a few shorter trips as well. I actually made a map of all the state parks that we've camped at in the last 27 months. I love camping as a relatively affordable way to see and explore Michigan. I'm not a hiking camper though. I don't want to carry everything in my back. I want to bring some comforts from home. But one of my favorite parts of camping is sitting by the fire first thing in the morning when it's still pretty chilly out. The coffee or the hot chocolate is ready and the fire is popping. Aside from shushing my kids every few minutes so that we don't disturb the other campers, it's a really peaceful time of day. There's something comfortable and comforting to me about sitting around a campfire. Campfires provide light and warmth, and it's also pretty important that the campfires stay in the designated areas, or Smokey the Bear is going to come after you talking about
only you can prevent wildfires.
Just like fire serves an important purpose when used correctly, but can hurt, kill, and destroy when it rages uncontrolled. I think some of our emotions can be like that. Today, we're going to be talking about anger and the incredibly important role that it plays in our lives and in our communities. Anger serves as an important purpose when it's cultivated appropriately, but it can hurt, kill, and destroy when it rages uncontrolled. So one of the things that we do here is that we'll stop throughout our message and we'll just give you a chance to process. What is your favorite thing to burn? Take a minute and just talk about it. So today we're continuing a series that we started last week called How to Have an Enemy. It's based on a book of that name by Melissa Florer-Bixler. This book is in our micro bookstore at all of our physical locations. You can pick it up the next time you're in worship, or you can always order it from your favorite online bookstore or a local bookstore. Melissa Florer-Bixler is a writer, pastor, and teacher who lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. Pastor Tom will be doing a live Q&A with Melissa Florer-Bixler on November 3rd at 7 p.m. and that will be streamed on our church Facebook pages and our YouTube channel. This question on how to have an enemy is a challenge to us, and it all comes back to this command of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount to love our enemies. He said, "You've heard it said that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that?" Many of us hear Jesus' words to love our neighbors and think that eliminates enemies, because how can you love someone who's your enemy? But Flora Bixler notes that Jesus does not call us to claim we no longer have enemies. Instead, he shows us how to have enemies well. Jesus expects that we will have enemies and challenges us to form a life that no longer exercises the self-destruction of hatred, of loathing, and of violence. We love our enemies when we create a world together that releases them from their own self-inflicted harm. We love our enemies as part of the family of God and as children of God. This series is inspired by that teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Last month, we began this 18-month-long deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount with series that are inspired by the topics in the Sermon on the Mount, like when Jesus says to love our enemies. Today, as we continue this series on how to have enemies well, we're going to be talking about anger. And I'm introducing the concept of anger as a spiritual discipline. Whew. Anger is a spiritual discipline. Now, the Christian tradition is conflicted on the subject of anger. A few years ago, Sycamore Creek did a series on the 7 deadly sins and explored anger, recognizing that some of our Christian tradition would say that anger is not productive in any fashion, where other parts of our Christian tradition would view anger as helpful in justice work. And then a few years later, Sycamore Creek did a series called No Offense, and we explored more deeply that side of our Christian tradition that says anger is unproductive and unhelpful. So today we're exploring the flip side that says anger is helpful in justice work. We're saying actually that anger is a spiritual discipline. And because it's a spiritual discipline, it needs to be disciplined. It takes practice. Just like safely handling fire requires someone who can show us good fire safety and what to do when things get out of hand, it requires practice. So too does anger. When we go camping, the truth is that I let my husband do pretty much all the things related to the fire. Like, I tend to be nervous around the fire. I'm nervous I'm going to do something wrong and hurt myself or hurt someone else. And there are lots of times that I'm also nervous about my anger, how to express it and when. I'm nervous that I'm going to hurt someone or do something wrong or hurt myself. But fire and anger, well, they're both important parts of life. Sure, you could make an argument that you could avoid fire altogether and be okay, but then you would miss gathering around the fire pit in the backyard. You'd miss roasting marshmallows. You'd miss cooking over a grill. And well, if you avoid all anger, you're going to miss chances to join with others in the spiritual discipline. And your anger, well, it doesn't just go away. It's going to leak out in other parts of your life in less than healthy ways. It's going to show up. So we need to know how to handle it well. We need to talk about how to safely handle our anger and what to do when it gets out of hand. We need to practice it. Like fire, anger can offer light that illuminates the forms of destruction that are active within our own lives and communities. But when it rages out of control, it can do a lot of damage. So our first key to anger as a spiritual discipline is that disciplined anger is shared. Flora Bixler says, without making space for anger, the church cannot offer safe harbor to people who are suffering at the hands of others. When we cultivate communal anger, we create communities that share burdens and creatively enact justice. All right, so when we cultivate shared anger, we become a safe harbor for those who are suffering at the hands of others. We let people know that their anger over the injustice they've experienced is not only welcomed in the space, but it's also echoed in the community. When we cultivate shared anger, we create communities that share burdens. Man, staying angry takes a toll on the nervous system. When the burdens take time to relieve, when the injustices aren't righted immediately, sharing anger relieves the burden that individual anger takes on the body. When we cultivate shared anger, we creatively enact justice. I noticed that Flora Bixler does not say we creatively combat injustice. It's so much more difficult to creatively enact justice. To build something that works for everyone is a Herculean task. And it requires all of us and our shared anger. Like, think about it. It is really easy to sit back and criticize someone for not getting it right. It's 1,000 times harder to build the thing and get it right from the outset. Like, what if we all work together to creatively enact justice? What could that look like? Notice the themes here. Shared anger is not about hurting, defending, or combating anything. Shared anger is about creating safety, sharing burdens, and working for justice. My family moved here to Lansing a little over 2 years ago, and we enrolled my 3 kids in the local school district. And along with all the other sort of typical records that we had to get, we also gathered up IEPs, individualized education plans, for 2 of my kids. IEPs exist for students who need something other than the standard education program in order to get a free, appropriate public education, which is a right that all students have in the United States. To make a long story short, the transition of their services was bumpy. The IEPs are meant to be revisited annually to ensure that adequate progress is being made on the student's goals and to reevaluate what resources or support a student needs to meet those goals. These decisions are based on data, standardized test scores, logs that teachers keep, that kind of stuff. And when we made it to the annual meeting for one of my kids, we were presented with a draft of their IEP that reflected a 70% reduction in service minutes. Service minutes are the minutes that my child receives specialized education from a special education teacher. I was pretty angry, and I took a weekend to think about the situation before I signed the document to approve that reduction. And during that time, I talked to some of my friends who are familiar with special education best practices, and they were angry too. And I realized that my instinct was correct and that I needed to go back to the special education team and advocate for my child to receive adequate services. So their shared anger gave me boldness to act on my child's behalf. Now, I'm not sharing this story to talk bad about the school district or those teachers. Every school district has its issues, and I think those teachers were doing the best with the resources they had. I'm sharing the story because that shared anger led to me bringing my friend Jana, a licensed psychologist, to my next meeting with me, and she advocated on our behalf. We were able to negotiate a satisfactory compromise for my kiddo. This was shared anger at work on a small scale. A bigger movement would be for us to advocate on behalf of our schools to get better resources, for more teachers and adequate support, to creatively enact a system that gives everyone a chance to thrive. If anger is like a fire, then shared anger is like fire contained to shed light. It shows us those places that we still need to work in our goal to enact justice, like advocating on behalf of our schools. And if we aren't willing or able to let that light shine inward, if we don't individually and collectively confront the enemy within ourselves, we're doomed to misplace responsibility onto others. And because the church is a community of reconciliation, we recognize that we bear both victim and victimizer in our bodies. Now, we're going to spend some more time on that idea that we bear both victim and victimizer in our bodies in just a moment, but I want to stop for another chat question. Shared anger is like a light, like fire discipline to share light. So have you ever used fire to see something more clearly? Take a minute and talk about it. Okay, so I just said that we bear both victim and victimizer in our collective bodies. Because we're a community working toward reconciliation, we have victims and victimizers in our community, like individual people who might fall into those categories. But we bear both victim and victimizer within our individual bodies as well. Because, well, we all have capacity to be harmed by the use of power and to harm others with our power. We all bear both victim and victimizer in our individual bodies. All right, I want to stop here for a detour to talk about power, because I'm making the claim that we all have power and have capacity to use it to harm others. To be clear though, I'm not making the claim that we all have the same power. All right, Diane Langberg, a Christian psychologist, has spent decades studying abuse and power in the church. In her book, Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church, she shares this illustration. Olivia, a tiny 4-day-old baby, knows nothing about herself or the world around her. She has no words and cannot effectively move her body anywhere, but something doesn't feel right. She doesn't know what it is or what she needs. Alone and in the dark, she cries. Olivia has power. Two exhausted sleeping adults are jolted from their much needed rest and quickly head toward the cry. She has disrupted two adults who have words to express their needs, who recognize their own needs and hers, and can move their bodies effectively. They recognize her cry and respond to it. Our English word power means having the capacity to do something, to act or produce an effect, to influence people or events, or to have authority. By our sheer presence in the world, we, God's image bearers, have power. The 4-day-old infant has the power to rouse two grown-ups from much needed sleep, and they have the power to meet her needs or ignore them. All of us have power. We all have capacity to be victim and victimizer, and our shared anger can help us to see those parts of ourselves and then creatively enact justice. I mentioned earlier what Jesus had to say about enemies in the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus also had something to say about anger and violence. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." This is the danger of anger that's carried by the individual instead of the community and is unexamined. This is where the flame of anger becomes destructive and causes harm. Flames, matches, bonfires, fireplaces, candles, they need to be handled in a particular way. They're incredibly useful, but they can cause pain. Everything from singed eyebrows and blisters to outright destruction, like forest fires and death. Now, I bet most of us have a funny story where we failed to harness fire well. Like maybe you attempted to cook something and half of it was raw and the other half was burnt. Maybe a friend got carried away with the accelerant and nearly started a forest fire. So let's pause here for a chat question. What's your best or most memorable fire story? We have to learn discipline with fire. And within the church, we must be disciplined in our anger. The second key to anger as a spiritual discipline is that disciplined anger is forged of God's forgiveness. I think I'm gonna let Flora Bixler explain what I mean. Listen to this. In the church, people form their lives within the reconciliation of the crucified Jesus, the Son of God, who absorbs the enmity of the world into the cross and renews creation. As believers, we're shaped by the reconciliation of Jesus, who absorbed the enmity of the world. Remember that enmity is the state of being an enemy. Jesus comes to us not grudgingly, but because God wills to share the divine life with us. Okay, so Jesus' reconciliation isn't forced or done begrudgingly. As it is, forgiveness is the form that life takes for people who are united to Christ. All right, so this is what it means to be united in Christ. This does not protect us from conflict or division. Neither does it stop us from giving and receiving harm. But within this life, indwelling within the renewed order of creation, we are forged of God's forgiveness. We are forged of God's forgiveness. All right, so later in Matthew's account of Jesus' life and ministry, in chapter 18, he records a parable that Jesus told in response to one of his followers asking how often he should forgive a person who harms him. This parable tells of a king who forgave one of his servants a huge amount of money, like 20 years of a day laborer's wage. The servant was at risk of losing everything, including his freedom because of his debt, and the king forgave it all. Leaving the king, that servant went out and found a person who owed him a relatively small amount of money. It was like 1 day's wage for a day laborer. In contrast to the 20 years of wage the other guy owed, this wasn't so bad, or at least it didn't need to be. But instead of showing the second servant the same forgiveness he was shown, the first servant had him thrown in jail. Well, people saw what happened and clued the king in on the situation. The king was outraged and threw the first guy in jail until he could repay his debt. Jesus looks at the crowd gathered and says, "This is how God in heaven will treat you if you can't forgive from your heart." This parable is often a burden for those who hear it, in that they must forgive their abusers and oppressors. That's the message that people receive. Stories of required forgiveness are painful for people who are not ready to forgive those who have assaulted or harmed them. And it should be noted that there are churches who harbor abusers for decades because of Jesus' radical teaching on forgiveness. And each time, it's assumedly excusing behavior in favor of forgiveness, 70 times 7 or whatever. We're forged in God's forgiveness, and we cannot use forgiveness to justify hiding predators. From this parable, we learn the considerable harm that occurs when we continue, corporately or individually, to expect forgiveness without extending it, without mutuality and reciprocity among a people who are entrenched in forgiveness. What we're getting to here is that undisciplined anger leads to retributive justice, justice which is based on retribution and punishment. But we are a people forged in God's forgiveness and practicing disciplined anger. And disciplined anger leads to transformative justice. Undisciplined anger leads to retributive justice. Disciplined anger leads to transformative justice. The first question of transformative justice is, what is the world that we want? Holy anger and righteous forgiveness find their source in this question. What is the world that we want? Undisciplined anger typically ends in punishment and rejection because it's bound to powers that repress and destroy. By contrast, the beloved community, this community of Christ that's forged in God's forgiveness, is a vessel within which it's possible for anger to be reimagined toward the wholeness of all. The church should cultivate anger in that particular way, disciplined in sharing it and forged in God's forgiveness. We will definitely not get this right all the time. We will probably wind up burning ourselves or others and sometimes, and we'll learn to tend those wounds until they heal. Fire can be harnessed to build community around s'mores, to create food, to refine metals, in blacksmithing, in tending fields for crops, in firing pottery. Disciplined fire is transformative. It transforms objects, fields, and foods for all kinds of purposes. Our disciplined anger can be transformative as well. The day after the Sandy Hook tragedy, Shannon Watts, a mother of 5, started a Facebook group with the message that all Americans can and should do more to reduce gun violence. That online conversation turned into a movement called Moms Demand Action. This grassroots movement of Americans is working for public safety measures that can protect people from gun violence. They work to pass stronger gun laws and work to close loops that jeopardize the safety of our families. Moms Demand Action has now established a volunteer chapter in every state of the country and is part of Every Town for Gun Safety, the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country with nearly 10 million supporters. Disciplined anger can lead to important change that creatively enacts justice. For anger to be a spiritual discipline, we need to practice it with each other, learning how to wield it carefully. It needs to be shared, and it needs to be forged in God's forgiveness. As we wrap up our message today, let's end with one more chat question. It's an invitation for you to reflect on what you've heard today. What is one way that you can practice anger in a disciplined way? Oh, we're rolling already? Oh.